Right, so yeah, I'm Rosie, and I studied in the town of Aberystwyth on the coast of Wales, which is a little seaside town. And the presentation I'm going to do for you today is on family Neritidae, which, as you probably guessed, are snails. Not like the land snails that you find in your garden, but they are snails that are aquatic, so they're found in freshwater, saltwater, and brackish water. They're more commonly known as nerites, and this is a graph of the world where the general ranges, and they're commonly found in the southern hemisphere, but some ranges spread up towards North Africa and Europe. There are around 830 species, and they're commonly found in intertidal zones, which are the land between the sea and the land. And the photo on the left here is rocks which are extending out into the sea, which is a common habitat for nerites. And then the photo on the right is storm damage afterwards, and you can see the damage done to the pavement, so I'm sure you can imagine what happened to these tiny little snails which are attached to the rocks. So they live in intertidal zones, which are quite an extreme ecosystem. So there's constantly changing environment. So they've got low tide levels where they've got air exposure for a while, and then they've got like the high tide where they're fully submerged underwater. So they need to be adapted to both environments several times a day. One intertidal zone is a mangrove ecosystem that they're found in. So they're commonly found on the roots and the trunks of the mangroves and on the rocks along the coast. And mangroves are saltwater. Well, they grow in salt water, so they're quite tolerant of that. So it's another brackish ecosystem. And nerites are very important because they're detritivores, which means that they break down waste so that decomposers can and return nutrients to the soil, which keeps a whole energy cycle going within this ecosystem. So they're quite an important factor for that. And then they're also primary consumers. So they eat algae, lichen, and phytoplankton. And it's important that they eat the algae because algae has a habit of taking over everything if it's not kept under control. So they play a good role in that. And they're also an important food source for birds and crabs and different types of fish. So I'm going to give you a bit of a background into snail structure so you can understand how they function. So they've got a hard exterior shell, and then they've got a softer body underneath with antennae, and then a little mouthpiece called a radula. And they've got a foot which they use for movement. They've got a little operculum which sits on the back of the foot. And there are some characteristics which are more specific to the nerites. So they have quite a thick shell, which is in this hemisphere shape that you can see here. They've got a variety of different colours and patterns depending on where they live and what species they are. And they've got a D-shaped operculum, and they're quite small, so they're between 2 and 26 millimeters long generally. And then, so this is a bit more detail about the operculum. You're probably like, what is an operculum? So it's essentially a trapdoor or a lid that goes on top of the snail to keep in moisture. So they get lots of air exposure, so they need the moisture to be trapped in so that they can continue to survive. And it also helps freshwater species during drought periods to stay moist. And they have a singular gill instead of lungs like we have. So that means that they need oxygen to be dissolved in the water so that they can breathe. So they need a constant supply of water so that they can successfully live. Another little factor is the radula, which is basically their mouthpiece. And it's got thousands of little teeth that you can see in the diagram on the left, which can extend to scrape off food into their mouth. And they use like different muscles to put it in and out. And then, yeah, here's a little clip that should hopefully play, but it should be showing the nerites eating the algae along the fish tanks. So they're quite common in aquariums because they are good at cleaning. So they're essentially nature's natural little cleaners. And yeah, so they're quite good with that. And in the video, there is a little bit of like a brown substance which pops out, which is snail poo. You're probably like, well, how do snails actually poo? So it starts in the stomach, and then it goes along to the intestines, and then it goes through to the kidneys where a bit more waste is put into it. And then it goes along this big tube to the mantle, and then it comes out at the anus at the top, which is, instead of ours is at the bottom, theirs is more near the heads or the sides at the top. And they're quite cool, but produce asexually. They produce an egg. So male internally fertilizes the egg. And not much is really known about the mating behavior, but they have found that the eggs are just released and they're placed onto shells. Another interesting fact is for the larvae to develop, which is like the in-between stage before they grow fully, they need to be exposed to salt water. So they have a life, like if they're freshwater species, they have a life cycle where they start in freshwater, they travel to saltwater, and then they're brought back to freshwater. And the alternative to this is cannibalism. So I guess in this case, being salty is a good thing so that your siblings don't eat you to help you grow. And yeah, so they've got a life of adventure and tragedy, which is quite common in Greek mythology, which is apparent because they're named after the Greek god Nerite. He was a young, handsome god. He was Aphrodite's lover. And Zeus called him to Olympus and he refused to go. So his punishment was he was turned into a shellfish. And so in the end, he became god of the sea snails. But now on to more current issues. So there are lots of issues they're facing, like pollution, human consumption, and global warming. And as this shows, when they're exposed to chemical pollutants, their diversity and abundance reduces. So there's a lot less of them compared to when there is no pollution around. So this was a study done in Fiji back in 2017. And another study has also found that they've got a maximum temperature that they can survive at. And because of global warming and the oceans warming, more and more species are starting to reach that lethal temperature and not be able to survive, which has led to population declines. And so we need to try and keep global warming to a minimum to try and keep these important little snails alive, basically. And because there's a lot more to them than meets the eye, which I hope that this presentation has shown. So thank you. And do you have any questions?